Ah, yes, and it is the final show of 2014. Your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park. And of course, the show is three women. And boy, do we have the A-team today. We've got Ashley Csanady, we've got Antonia Zerbasis, we've got Andrea Houston, all journalists par excellence. They're on, and we're going to be talking about all things 2014 and looking ahead to 2015. So welcome, Ashley.
Good morning. Thanks for
Welcome,
having
Andrea.
Good morning.
Welcome, Antonia.
Hello.
You're sounding sexy and deep.
Well,
But that's because you're
I'm
at home
not
and retired
a morning
now.
person, so how do you know I'm not in bed?
That's true. And of course, the other women, the women behind the scenes you don't hear, are Marcia and Monique, the M team. Just bringing it home as always. So let's start with 2014. Ashley, you go first. What were the big stories? Let's start federal. Big Canadian stories that sort of jump up to you in 2014.
I think there were still the lingering bits of the Senate scandal at the beginning of the year, and we almost forget about that now. We saw those charges in July. There's been a lot that's happened since then. The incursion in the Ukraine and our role there, our role going into Iraq to combat ISIS are obviously very big stories as well. And I think one of the things I found really depressing about 2014 is it all seemed to be about preparing for the 2015 election. We've almost entered that permanent electoral cycle that the States has, and I do find that a bit disheartening at times. I think there's been some great policy ideas that have started to come out in advance of that. We've seen the child care debate started by the federal NDP, the debate on income splitting. I think that was a big story this year. The conservative proposal to allow nuclear families essentially to split their income,
Which only benefits those who make
exactly
a significant amount of money. But anyway,
but it's worth having that discussion,
Yeah,
right?
of
Like
course,
I think it started an important discussion about what we want to do with some of this surplus money. Jim Flaherty's death was another big moment federally that again seems like forever ago, but I think it was March, and then the funeral was in April. It sounds about right.
Yeah, it's strange that you mentioned that because you're right. It does seem like forever. Like it seems years ago that I was
forgot
at
about
that funeral. What about you, Andrea? Big stories.
I mean, for me, the big stories are different from what you would see on the traditional, like, top 10 New Year's big stories list. Like, for me, obviously, nationally we'll probably point to, and most stories will point to the shootings in Ottawa as the biggest, federal story of the year. And I think Ashley's absolutely right that and many other stories will be, paving the way to a federal election. And, different political personalities and leaders will be using that story either to argue for or against, increasing security and some of these other things. But for me, some of the biggest stories of the year was watching the Senate committee hearings regarding sex work and Bill C-36 and trans rights and watching them, both be stalled in, these dinosaurs of our that make up our Senate. So those are, for me, the big stories, but also looking internationally, the missing girls and some of the human rights atrocities that have happened around the world. The attack on Gaza, I watched that incredibly closely, and it was shocking to see the disparity between what we were seeing on the news and what we were seeing on Twitter. And I was just speaking with my partner last night at dinner, and I said, this year, probably more so than any other year except for the Arab Spring, we've seen Twitter become this tool of revolution. We've watched Ferguson explode and solidarity protests erupt around the world from, New York to Hong Kong, and it's just been so exhilarating and inspiring to watch this revolution take hold for justice and freedom. So that's been what I've been watching this year.
Antonia, what about you?
Well, I seem to be pretty much in concurrence with what Andrea is interested in, which isn't surprising since we're both Facebook and Twitter buddies. But for me, right now, I'm watching yet another omnibus bill, which seems to have exceeded even the last few omnibus bills and are shocking in their reach. Everything from environmental deregulation to even gender de-equitization, or de-equalization, if I can call it that, when it comes to contractors for the government. So there's that. There's C-36, or as it's now known as despicably known as the protection of communities, as if women who accept money for sex need to be, swept out of communities, and exploited persons, as if women who can be independently choosing to do this work are being exploited. Act. And it's a law that, to me, opens the door to the regulation of women's bodies. And I just shake my head that not all feminists are on board on this one, and feeling the same way that I do. And then, of course, the last but far from least is oil prices. And I am watching this with literally bated breath, because I have no idea not only on the impact on our economy and what the Harper government will do to make up for the loss of his, shall we say, vision in making us a petro state, but also the global implications, whether it is on Russia or the Middle East or just about everywhere, not to mention the climate.
Now, on the federal beat still, one name that I didn't hear any of you mention, it's kind of interesting, and I suppose not really federal politically, but CBC is federal. John Ghomeshi was, and you, Antonia, started a hashtag that really, talking about social media, really went viral. Maybe tell us a little bit about that and what's happening with that now.
Well, first of all, the hashtag, it just continues to go around the world. I mean, it seems to have died down somewhat.
And what is that hashtag?
Been raped, never reported. But it has opened the door for many, mostly women, some men, mostly women, to shed whatever shame or self-blame. Sorry, I have a dog in the background who doesn't know why I'm up so early. Shame or self-blame with respect to having been assaulted at some point or at many points in their lives. And what happened was, with this hashtag, my friend in Montreal, Sue Montgomery, who is the justice reporter for the Gazette, and I, behind the scenes on Facebook, were going back and forth on what was happening with the women who had come forward in the Ghomeshi case, and how they were getting a lot of doubt on social media. And Sue suggested that we put together a list and sign it and pass it around amongst other women we knew, and then publicize it in some way, and then it just became been raped, never reported. And what, to me, and it was just one more thing in many, many things that I saw. Andrea mentioned revolution on social media, and she's completely right, but what I saw also was the renaissance of the feminist discussion on feminist media in a way that it hadn't been discussed in maybe decades. Before it was, I don't need feminism, and third wave feminists were being, our moms accomplished this, that, and the other thing, but everything is A-okay now. Well, guess what? It isn't. And unfortunately, it does seem to center mostly on sexual assault. And I say unfortunately because it means that we haven't moved forward from 40 years ago or 50 years ago, as you, Sherry, came forth and joined us. No, but I'd like to see it move into other areas now, whether it's pay equity or child care or reproductive rights. Men. Yeah.
The victimizers. There have been a few, but not very many. Just on sort of on that note, we're still talking federally. And by the way, we are live, so talking about social media, the best way to get your voice into this conversation, your question, comment, send me a tweet at CHERIDINOVO, or you can phone in the station if you're one of those gregarious sorts, 416-946-7000. On the federal scene, another name I didn't hear, but it's coming up in spring, which leads me to a question. Do you think we'll have a spring or fall election federally? Mike Duffy, because his case hits court. So some of the thinking was that federally we may, Harper may call an election before that happens. What do you think, Ashley, on that?
I actually don't think he's going to call an early election. I know we had those charges in July in the Senate scandal, and it's possible that will start winding its way through the courts as early as the spring. But we also know how slow the Canadian justice system is. There's a good chance that some of those preliminary hearings could take a really long time. I'm just not sold on the spring election idea yet. I don't think he would come out as strongly in interviews, say recently on the National with Peter Mansbridge, and say, I'm going to honor that fixed date election, if they were even mulling it right now. Then again, we have seen parties do this in the past where they've said we won't do it, and then something will happen that they'll be like, okay, it's time to go. I think at least we'll see a budget, because they'll want to throw a lot of goodies out. I think that they have a lot more money than the other parties, so instead of an early election, we'll just see a lot of attack ads for the next 10 months until the actual campaign spending period.
Yay!
Yeah, rules come into place when the writs are drawn up, because there are no limits on what they can spend before that happens. So I'm still firmly in the October election camp, but maybe I'll be proven wrong.
Well, he's coming up. Harper's coming up in the polls slightly, ever so slightly, but the trend is there. Does it strike fear in your heart, Antonia?
It strikes disappointment in my heart, and the reason I say that is that to me the media in Canada are letting us down. I'm talking about the big corporate media generally. And I understand, that the economics, having just, recently left the Toronto Star, and I understand the economics and the pressures on the businesses. I do. But it's too much of the next shiny object right now in the media, and I include CBC in that. I don't see these attack ads because I no longer watch programs such as The National or even Newsworld. I cannot bear to watch the news anymore because there is too much celebrity trash and that kind of thing. So, my feeling around an election and polls and Harper perhaps getting better approval ratings, or the cons getting more approval within the polls, is that I don't think the media are doing their job. And if you look at the interview that Peter Mansbridge did with Stephen Harper, it was softball after softball. Nobody is holding these guys, to the wall and, firing the bullets they need to fire. And consistently, it's like everything that happened 2 months ago is down the river and it's today. And nobody's sort of listed everything and keep coming back over and over and over again, whether the Harper government, on the Harper government's actions towards women or foreign policy, and I include Israel in that. I mean, it's just, okay, that was yesterday. Let's move on.
Yeah, and Andrea, just on another topic too, I want to throw this in because it hasn't been mentioned federally, and I want to move on to provincial and municipal as well, but missing and murdered Indigenous women, we didn't mention that.
I was actually just going to mention that because on that interview with Stephen Harper, when he was asked that question, and he, very callously and said, "Oh, it's not high on our priority list right now," that would have been the opportunity for a journalist to bounce back and say, it should be high on your priority list because of such and such and such. Same with climate change. He, blatantly lied. He said that the, emissions are going down when that is completely false. They're going up. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The media is not doing their job. They're not calling leaders on falsehoods and misinformation, and we wonder why the voters don't have all the information needed when it comes time to vote. All you have to do is just look at the election and the campaign around Rob Ford to know how misinformation and partisan politics and populism generally can really skew an election when the media isn't there to call them on it.
You're still working in the
Yeah.
Antonia's retired, Andrea's going in and out. You're full-time boogie. So what's your response?
I think it's both a question of resources and a question of the way the message is controlled in Ottawa and the way that reporters are, I don't want to use the word harassed, but I almost do want to use the word harassed by communications professionals. If you so much as, run a couple lines that they find contrary to what they think their message track is on a subject, like they'll come back. And I can't imagine what it's actually like to work in Ottawa right now, because it seems to me that if you push too hard in an interview or whatever, you'll be completely shut out. So I think there's a weird game. I think we also need to remember too that for whatever reason, Ottawa is very well staffed right now, historically compared to other times. Some of the bureaus are a bit smaller, but there is still, compared to a lot of other places in this country, there's still quite a saturation of journalists in Ottawa. But I think a lot of the way that the message is manipulated, they make it harder to get at real numbers and budgets and estimates and expense, reports that do have to come out. They change their accounting standards. You can barely read the federal budget. Like there's no, balance tables that you find, say, in the provincial budget. Like at least that you can read and see what they're saying, right? So I think that there are a lot of barriers to journalists doing their work. And I think part of it might actually be the way social media has come in too, because you can't tweet a fact without 6 people from all 3 parties coming at you with different interpretations of how you're biased in that moment. So I think
things are partisan.
People are so worried about coming across as biased that they don't want to call a spade a spade. They don't want to say, look, they told us the sky is green, so the Conservatives say the sky is green, and this other party says the sky is blue, and we're going to leave it to you to decide. But there was a time when journalists said, the sky is blue, a spade is spade. Here are the numbers on missing and murdered and Aboriginal women. Here are the numbers on climate change, where they called people to account more. But for some reason, the culture of appearing unbiased seems to have watered down that ability, because people who call out something that the government says that's misinformation or not factual is not factual are called biased. And we saw the same thing with Rob Ford, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the same playbook.
Yeah.
Now, Antonia, to get back to you on the environment for a bit, Keystone XL. Just before we leave the federal scene, this is something that Harper's been pushing. Obviously, I think Justin said he'll, votes for it. And not to show my partisan bias, I have to say Gary Dewar is also shilling for it in Washington as our ambassador, former NDP premier. So, everybody has their hands a little dirty on this one. You think it's going to pass? Think it's going to happen?
No, not under Obama's watch, certainly. There's nothing in it for the United States. There is absolutely nothing in it. And unless Canada has, there may be a few jobs to build the pipeline, but there will be maybe a few dozen to maintain it. And the United States is just going to be, the bridge from Alberta to the Texan port to the ships, right? There's like nothing in it for the United States, so there's no upside for Americans except for the oil lobby. So from day one, I never saw this passing. And then when I saw the environmentalists and the protests and the Daryl Hannahs and the Naomi Kleins of the world rising up, and again, this became a social media, right? No KXL revolution, and then look what happened to the Northern Gateway pipeline. I knew that it was not, contrary to what my editors kept saying when I kept saying, this isn't going to happen for 4 years.
There you go, Ashley, you can blame the editors.
I literally was saying this for 4 years.
The editors.
And they kept saying, no, it's a done deal. And look where we are now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not a done deal, and I will bet any amount of money it'll never happen.
Okay, what do you think, Ashley?
I think Keystone might have had a better shot maybe 10 years ago when we were more worried about energy independence in North America. And I think that because there's been so much that's come online, whether natural gas or oil, I'm just not sure the impetus is there for the States. And again, I think Obama kind of wants a couple places where he feels like he can leave a legacy, and this is one, right? And there's also this bizarre arcane tribunal in North Dakota that might end up being one of the final words on it that has something to do. It's not even related to the environment, but for some reason they have to approve it. I wish I could remember what it was called. It's killing me now. Yeah. But I'm question actually where Hillary Clinton would fall on this, because I
front runner apparently.
Yeah, exactly. Because she has always been a little bit more to the right of Obama and has always been a bit more hawkish on foreign policy. And I could see her still having a long-term view to energy independence for the States. But I just, again, I totally agree with Antonia that there's no net benefit for the U.S.
No.
Before we leave federal, and since we lapsed across the border there for a minute, we got to talk about the torture.
Yeah.
I mean that because we're slightly implicated in that, but we are. But certainly, talking about social media, there's this huge wave of, somebody needs to be held accountable for what happened. And Obama it's both Democrats, in fact, very much Democrats, and Republicans,
Totally.
both of that. Andrea, William?
Well, I think it's really interesting that the torture report sort of broke at the same time as the interview scandal was happening. And, we saw so much anger
Have
around.
you seen that film? Anybody seen
I
that
haven't
film?
seen the
Admit
film.
it,
Yeah.
admit it.
You have seen it?
I've seen it, and boy, is it bad. I honestly think it's a plot by Sony just to
I do
get
too.
more money.
That's crossed my mind.
They didn't make any more on it than they did with the last stupid comedy from Seth Rogen and James Franco. They actually made
Really
less,
sick of
so-
those two. Like, I'm really.
God, it's so bad.
So much anger and, people wanting to protest and take to the streets demanding that this movie be shown, which, from what I understand, I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, it's pretty racist and pretty
it's
homophobic
sexist,
and
it's awful.
sexist.
It's-
Awful movie.
It's just stupid, locker room humor.
totally-
It's the usual Seth Rogen kind
Yeah.
of. If you go into that
Stoners
mentality,
bumbling around. Yeah.
It's entertaining.
But so this movie happened,
laughs, but
and
that's
there's so
about
much anger and passion around it. But then at the same time, we had a report that described these horrendous, gruesome, tragic things that were done on under the watch of the government, and
To a lot of innocent people.
to a lot of innocent people that I didn't even
Whether they're guilty or not, torture. Who knew we were?
Yeah.
This is
but not a
assumed these
blip.
days.
I didn't hear. I've heard very little anger from the general public about this. We heard a few pundits speaking about it. We heard obviously it on the news, but I didn't see the same kind of passion
Andrea.
over for a movie.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about the shiny object.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's much easier to talk about a Seth Rogen film than it is to talk about the report is apparently only a summary of the real report, and even that apparently is redacted. Than it is to get into how horrible a country we are. I'm talking as an American. And, and not only that, but the polls showed that people approved of using these techniques to get information, and that they believe that torturing people will stop terrorism in some way.
Yeah.
So
It is
I think
terrorism.
that's the key, right? Like that goes back to the misinformation. A decade ago longer, there was this narrative that was created that America must do anything it can to protect itself from this idea of terrorism. If they're going to be ruthless, we're going to be ruthless, and that's clearly saturated public opinion if people are condoning torture in
Not
2014.
to mention, the media, the artistic so-called media, but we all grew up on James Bond films where it's License to Kill, and Homeland where torture is assumed. Many movies, in fact, when you think about it, that's assumed torture is now this mode that is in use by all governments. So why not us? If you just tuned in, by the way, you're listening to Three Women, Sherry DeNovo, MPP, Parkdale High Park, and we've got the A-Team. We've got Antonia Zerbasis. We've got Ashley Csanady. We've got Andrea Houston, all weighing in about 2014 and 2015. You can too. I've got a couple of comments on Twitter. You can tweet me at CHERIDINOVO, or you could phone 416-946-7000 if you want to be on air. We are live. So federal, let's move into provincial. Doesn't get a lot of media play, but things happen.
It did this year.
Things happen. Let's start off with the hard drive being wiped, $10,000. Ashley, take us away.
Well, who knew you could get 10 grand for wiping a hard drive?
You're in the
do it all
wrong job.
time.
Right? That'd be nice. You almost, I'm not saying I do, but you almost feel bad for Kathleen Wynne, because this clearly was something that was done under a previous administration staff. And I sometimes feel like they're finding out stuff along with the investigation, because if they'd known this, they would have paid the money back earlier to prevent it from being an issue and say, oh no, like we took care of it. You would have tried to get ahead of it, right? So I feel like they keep getting blindsided in their agenda by something that the last premier rightly resigned over.
I'd like to see some more anger from her. Then.
From her, yeah. And
hugging
I feel like
him.
that's a party. That's a party thing, right?
Yeah,
trying to keep it nice. But again, this all really does go back to David Livingston, a McGuinty staffer. We don't know what McGuinty knew or didn't know about the
obviously
situation.
This does. I mean, a staffer just doesn't take it upon themselves to
Exactly.
wipe hard drives.
Yeah.
Well, they pushed
cut
for this
themselves
access.
a check for 10,000. I mean,
Yeah.
this was clearly a party decision, and clearly,
clearly-
clearly the corner office was involved in this. I mean, so what's I guess shocking to me, again, we were talking about how we're not shocked at torture. Well, we're not shocked at wasting billions of dollars either.
And
Obviously,
we saw that in the election, right? Like someone said to me during the campaign, the gas plants were baked into the numbers before the campaign started. How you felt about the gas plant scandal was there. So if nothing that sort of came out during the campaign, there were a few things that trickled out, really seemed to sway the numbers because of that. I think that, it is a few years old. The cover-up is always worse than the crime. I'm not sure that the actual decision to cancel the gas plants is what makes people angry. It's the long-term costs afterwards. And again, the egregious part is this concerted effort to cover something up, to delete the records that belong to the public, going through, pushing for the computer access. Livingston apparently pushed the public service for the computer access for this Peter Feist person to actually wipe these hard drives, to get the permissions to do that, because the public service knew that something was wrong and they were breaking the law and deleting the records of the people of Ontario. And that's the real
Exactly.
Now, the opposition parties are going to scream for blood as soon as they, before and of course when the House comes back, and that's going to be what everybody's going to be
There's
talking
an ongoing
about.
OPP investigation.
Absolutely. There might be charges laid still. But again, I guess, this doesn't seem like such a big deal in light of torture. But I mean, again, I guess what strikes me is the general public just assumes this is what all politicians do, and that billions are wasted, and this is just the way the game is played. What do you think, Antonia?
I think the level of cynicism out there, bordering on apathy, with waves to apathy, is rather frightening. And, over the holidays, I spent time with younger members of my family, trying to convince them why they must vote and why this is important. And, but they are so wrapped up in whatever it is that they are wrapped up, and I'm talking about 20-somethings and even 30-somethings, that, I just shake my head and I keep saying, you don't understand. This is the world that you will inherit, being created and shaped by these people, but they have no idea. If you said to them, wiping hard drives, they have no clue. If you say, I don't know, Pierre Poutine, if they think it's a new dish, at McDonald's.
Drunk food.
So that's, for me, the way I perceive it, right? They don't read newspapers. They follow things on social media, but they tend to be cats and trivia.
But to be fair, we're going to sound like grumpy old women here. But to be fair, I mean, we've got Occupy, we've got people in the streets over Ferguson, and we've got lots of action.
Sherry, you're absolutely right, and we do. But it's and if this were Quebec, I would agree with you completely, because you can turn out literally tens of thousands of people in Quebec into the streets within minutes, right? It just goes like waves of them. But here in the rest of Canada, or in the most of Canada, as one of my friends calls it just isn't happening, because we are so diverse from one province to another with such different interests in each region that it's almost like we are not in the same country.
I think it's sometimes people also don't know what to be angry about. I think there's also French protest culture. I think that's something we should probably note as well.
It's party culture.
Yeah. But I think sometimes we were talking about the shiny object. What to be mad about today? I mean,
outrage porn.
Just this year, it was outrage porn. And I think that we were talking about revolutions on Twitter, but I also sometimes feel like it lets people become more complacent because they send out a tweet for Bring Back Our Girls when Boko Haram kidnapped all those girls in Nigeria, or they send out a tweet calling for a missing, murdered Aboriginal women's inquiry, or they send something out about been raped, never reported, or yes, all women.
Some
and
video
they feel
clip
like
of a
they've
police
done their,
officer.
Exactly. Something about Ferguson
assaulting,
or criming while white.
Yeah,
One
yeah,
about
that was a good one. Yeah.
white kids don't get scared doing this stuff, and then they feel like they've done their part, and then they also don't know what to really care about. I mean, every day you're given something else that's apparently the worst thing ever, that everybody is all enraged and you almost feel it sometimes, like when you finish a day spending it on social media, and you're just like, I'm exhausted. And it's because everybody's angry, amped up, channel 10 all the time. And so what do you care about? Do you rally about Bill C-36 and sex workers' rights? As a Canadian, should we really, like, is it worth my time to be rallying about something that's going on in the States? We have issues here. Let's talk about our police racial issues instead of saying we're in solidarity with Ferguson. Let's talk about what's left with Carding. Let's talk about what's left with, let's look at our incarceration numbers.
We have brutality as well.
We have brutality as well. I've seen I saw a cop brutally take down a sex worker about 8 months ago, and it still like haunts me in my mind. And it didn't get involved. There was another girl and we talked about it afterwards. Like, should we have done something? And do you? Like, then you get arrested, right? Like, what happened?
Or you are at risk for, getting involved in something that you don't know. I mean, it might not be a police officer that is assaulting. It might be somebody else, and you don't want to. Yeah.
Well, we're going to take just a brief break, pay some bills, and we will be right back at you with the A-Team, talking about all things political. Yes, we women do that. Back in a few minutes.
Right here, right now, every day. CIUT 89.5, Toronto. Sound of your city.
All I wanna get is a little bit closer. All I wanna know is, can you come a little closer? Here comes the breath before we get a little bit closer. Here comes the rush before we touch. Come a little closer. The doors are open, the wind is really blowing. The night sky is changing overhead. It's not just our physical. I'm the type who won't get up so crazy.
The lyrics. It was awesome.
And so we are back, and we're dancing around the studio here on Three Women. You're listening to with Antonia Zerbasis, with Ashley Csanady, with Andrea Houston, the A-Team, as I call them. We're talking about all things political. We talk federal, we're talking provincial now. And just on that note, so Ashley, we'll start with you. You're kind of mired in that world. The Auditor General woman, Bonnie, came out with a report saying that the province wasted $8 billion on privatizing some of the essential services, and was then, this is the feminist moment, Bob Shirelli, who's the energy minister, said, well, she just didn't understand the file. She apparently had been, and take it away, Ashley.
Okay, well, I think there's two things there, because Shirelli's comment was to do with her audit of whether the smart meters have done anything to curb people's use of electricity during, off-peak and peak hours to try and get people to conserve when we need it more. And then the $8 billion was also, the thing I find concerning about the discussion we're having about that $8 billion with the privatization is that her analysis was actually very technical, and it was talking about, so the $8 billion's in reference to public-private partnerships to build major infrastructure projects like the Eglinton Crosstown, like hospitals. And so she said that they have gone, essentially they've spent $8 billion more than they budgeted for a bunch of infrastructure. But the reason we moved to public-private partnerships was, for a long time, every project went billions over to build a hospital, to build a crosstown. So if you actually look at the net benefit of public-private partnerships, I think that Infrastructure Ontario does still have a strong argument for the value there. I know ideologically and from your stance that
it's okay,
that's
we like
not
a
the way
good
to see it.
debate.
But I think that that $8 billion can actually be manipulated, and the facts of it are so complex that it's really difficult to have that conversation in the public, to tell people first they need to understand what a public-private partnership is, then they need to understand what infrastructure used to cost, then they need to understand what we've spent versus what was budgeted and what that would have cost before, right? So there's a lot of ways that the numbers can be manipulated by all sides there to get to the core of the issue.
But isn't the thing, I'm going to weigh in here a little bit, and then Antonia, I'll let you take it away. But I mean, I'm a corporation, let's say, and I'm bidding on a public project. The difference between me and a public servant, other than wages, which is a major one often, because often the public servants are unionized and the private ones aren't, but is profit. I need to show a profit to my shareholders at the end of the day. So I guess just I mean, this is just kind of 1 and 1 makes 2. How can, unless the wages are worse, the work is shoddier, or the equipment, the materials are cheaper, how can private build cheaper than public? Antonia, what do you think about this?
I have never believed that private could do cheaper than public ever, without exploiting people or exploiting the environment. And it's as simple as that. It's just not possible.
I think we have to remember, though, private companies were always the ones doing the construction work. I mean, we were hiring Ellis Don as a province 20 years ago. We're hiring Ellis Don now. The difference is that we're hiring one company whose contract is beholden to a set amount of money to build and maintain that building for a set period of time. So the profit that they make in those contracts is actually tied to them coming in on budget. And then they're the ones hiring all those other contractors that we've hired for decades. I mean, the public service doesn't have a construction branch that goes out and builds a hospital. They have Infrastructure Ontario that goes out and through the procurement process
used to build things way back in the day. I mean, it's not always been farmed out. Yeah. Andrea, you have anything to say about this?
I agree with Antonia. I think that I think we all often when services are privatized, what is sacrificed is the rights of workers, the wages of workers, and the environment, and we can't sacrifice these things. We have
I come back to the gas plants, e-health. These are all
Absolutely.
examples of privatized.
And this isn't just a provincial
Mars,
thing. We're seeing we're seeing it at the municipal level too. This is where governments are going in an effort to save money and cut costs, and it's really unfortunate, and it's difficult to stop when governments are saying, well, this is saving money at the expense of workers or at the expense of the environment. Well, it's hard to argue with that.
People need to start voting for policies where they spend more money, because if we want to keep everything in public hands, whether it's our garbage in Toronto or it's how infrastructure is built, then people need to be more willing to pay for higher costs to build those things, to provide those higher wages to workers, and to provide those environmental protections. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the more this happens, the more everybody's boat sinks.
Yeah.
So it's, why is it that the supposed people's paper, for example, the Toronto Sun, is so fiercely anti-union? It makes no sense to me.
Yet they're unionized workers, are they not?
Yeah. One of the reasons the Canadian middle class, as the New York Times reported just a few days ago, is much stronger, both economically and I wouldn't say emotionally, but in terms of family values, and I don't mean it in the anti-gay sense, is because we have more unions. We are much more highly unionized country than in the United States. And if more people are having decent jobs, and of course we have medical care, then we can afford to go and spend a little bit more money and are not seeking the cheapest deal possible when it's being made in China or some sweatshop in overseas, which it exports jobs overseas, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. And that's how I see a lot, not all of it, but a lot of privatization. And in general, when you privatize something, and for example, the CBC has been slowly privatized over the past 30 years. Now, at one point, it was almost completely commercial, and then radio, lost its commercials, and CBC did as well to a great extent, not completely, television, I mean. And now we're seeing a virtual privatization of CBC, and I don't know how anybody here feels about it, but I don't think it's any better. I think it's much worse.
So just last kick at the can on the provincial side. Ashley, who's going to win the Progressive Conservative leadership in the spring, and what difference do you think that'll make?
I think it'll be Christine Elliott. I think that they would be foolish not to go for her. I think that if they do, it'll be historic because we'll have all women leading all three parties at Queen's Park. That's great. And I think that she would be the kind of more moderate, more reasonable voice that party needs. There is a sort of bombastic Tea Party-esque style to some of her opponents. We have seen Monty McNaughton saying some pretty atrocious things about the sex ed curriculum. Back when the anti-bullying bill was going through committee, Lisa McLeod said some pretty atrocious things in that committee, and I'm surprised no one's gone through those hand serves
And she was muzzled as well by her own party during that. She actually wasn't. Because she was actually saying kind of moderate things,
and then it got worse
and
as the committee hearings went on. Like if you
of the government,
and it got kind of
the party
she got kind of like at the beginning she was quite moderate, and then by the end of the committee hearings she was really all the other people against the gay straight alliances. She was being really like soft and it was bizarre.
Yeah,
but I think Christine Elliott will be really bad for Wynne. I think she's essentially Wynne a little bit more to the right as far as how the people would see her. Yep. And the only thing that I would be curious about is how she will run that caucus. Although I think she comes across quiet, I feel like behind closed doors, she's probably a very tough lady and would maybe whip them into shape a little bit. Yeah, she has 3 boys handling triplets. I think you can
exactly.
Yeah.
Nice exterior. What do you think, Antonia?
I completely agree. I wouldn't even be able to name any other candidate at this point without shuddering. And I credit even the most conservative of conservative Ontario voters as being intelligent enough to realize that she is the only possibility. This doesn't mean that somewhere out there in the 905 or 519 or beyond that there are people who are basically of the HarperCon ilk, Reform Party ilk, but she can actually, and I think that Ashley is right, that Wynne has a lot to fear in her leadership.
Now I'm biased a little bit, of course, because I've co-authored some bills with Christine. But suffice to say, I mean, yes, she does at least seem sane and reasonable, and she is.
Well, one of those bills obviously is this trans rights bill. I wonder if
she voted on that. But here's the thing: they all voted in lockstep against, for example, just recently the childcare bill that came by, which was by no means a great bill, but at least it was something, and childcare advocates wanted it. And the debate was really quite telling, I thought, from the conservative benches, because they were all on side about, a woman's right to choose, i.e. very Harper-esque, to stay home and look after your children.
Yeah.
So there was a kind of uniformity, and they all voted against the $15 a day childcare opposition motion. So childcare is not going to be part of even a Christine Elliott Conservative Party, just to put that, which I found a little disappointing, because I thought maybe there'd be a little bit more progressive in the Progressive Conservative.
Give her time. She's not the leader, so she doesn't yet have the power to dictate that policy. Let's see what happens, what plays out with childcare on the federal stage in 2015. I mean, if I were a provincial leader, there's a lot of issues you'd be kind of holding close to your chest to wait to see what happens this year with how the electorate falls come 2015, especially if you're not looking at an election until 2018. So I think for them that was, opposing what the government does and saying that they would do something better instead of perhaps trying to make an inevitable piece of legislation better because it is a majority government. But I do remember when that bill was first introduced in the minority, trying to get a straight answer out of their then education critic, Rob Leone, who lost his seat in the June election. And literally I kept asking him the same question. I was like, but what do you think of the bill? And he would just give this, we think women should have the decision. I was like, no, what do you think of the substance of this bill about changing ratios, all the technical things that it did? And they didn't know what they wanted to say. And so I think that might have been them holding the line on just opposing until they have a leader to make those calls.
Yeah. Andrea, last word on provincial.
Yeah, I think that we will definitely see a shakeup, and the progressive conservatives will be taken away from this socially conservative end that they have taken, and I think that they will gather a lot more votes from that middle section, that mushy middle, and it should strike fear into Kathleen Wynne's heart. But I think it could also change what happens at the federal level. I mean, if we have a progressive conservative leader who is a co-signer on Toby's Act and is very much believes in human rights, is not against, LGBTQ issues, I don't know where she stands on sex work, but these types of issues.
She supports Bill C-36.
She supports Bill C-36, but I think that she's reasonable. She comes across as very reasonable, and that could affect federal policies, especially around things like trans rights, which is still stuck in the Senate.
A better rapport with the feds, of course,
exactly,
because of her late husband.
Yeah.
But I think we also, the thing that I find hilarious too, though, is that all the other contenders, Monty McNaughton, Lisa McLeod, Vic Fideli, they're all extremely nice and reasonable one-on-one in person. It's the second they get in that question period character, or they start trying to play to some base that they don't really realize that it's a minority of Ontarians that have these anti-sex ed reform views or these anti-trans rights views or these anti-GSA views. You just need to look at the polling numbers to see that it's a very it's not an electable group to go after, right?
Very vocal on social media, though.
Yeah,
I must say,
very vocal.
I tend not to block them because I want to hear what they're saying.
Yeah, no, totally.
But
if I can just say it,
sure.
I don't worry about social conservatism and I don't think that that's the issue here with in terms of childcare. Mm-hmm. I think that any bill on childcare will never pass, coming from the conservatives, because they are fiscal conservatives, I think, foremost. Mm-hmm. And
it's just too expensive at the end of the day.
Raising taxes in Ontario in any way, or sidetracking your taxes, whether you're a rich Ontarian who pays enough taxes and who feels quite resentful, or a poor Ontarian who sees taxes as a threat to you in the same way. In the middle, we have a little bit more sort of liberal idea of what taxes mean for all of us. But once you say subsidized daycare, man, people are going to go running the other way.
Yeah, sadly. Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on, because talking about Tories that are a little bit more progressive, apparently we elected one in Toronto, John Tory. So he's out there. He's polling really well. What do you think? What do you think? We'll start with you again, Antonia. What do you think about John Tory?
He's very nice. He's very nice. I was very, very discouraged during the municipal. It's so nice to talk freely now that I've left the Star. I was very disappointed during the municipal election to talk to people, in my condo, or my friends, who all were saying that they were going to vote Tory because they were so afraid of Ford coming in. And when you would start outlining, Tory's record or Tory's policies, they would say they didn't care. At least he wasn't Ford, and he had a better chance. Now I'm willing to give, now that he's in, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt in some areas, but basically we are looking at, some people have described it, I think, somewhat extremely as, Rob Ford with better manners and a nicer suit. It's not that bad, but I do not see the kinds of spending that needs to be made to recoup everything that's been lost in this city.
Yeah, Ashley, just in terms of media coverage, it almost feels like there was this huge press corps that developed over the Rob Ford phenomena at City Hall, and it almost feels like they're all still there, but there's nothing to report. So we're hearing about every little council meeting because
it's the real stuff to report, though, right? That's the stuff that we didn't get to hear about because they were just frantically trying to keep up with every single drunken, circus incident. So, and it was very difficult for the press corps.
And I think that's the great thing about this is people are all of a sudden caring about city politics and the minutiae of city politics and the policy of city politics in a way that they don't with other levels of government because it was so bad under the Ford era. I mean, they would come out with these ridiculous ideas like monorails and Ferris wheels and so now there's a level of attention there, a level of scrutiny that I really do hope holds. I really do hope that the public attention holds because they won't keep all those reporters there if the stories stop getting the clicks, stop getting the reads. The responsible papers will keep a decent size, but you also see a lot of the really good reporters who showed their stuff during the Ford era have gone on to bigger and better things, especially in the broadcast area because that was just such a tough slow for them. But I also do think that, a lot of people are giving Tory the victory for the not Ford vote. I also think that Olivia Chow's campaign failed in giving a not Tory vote option. She was, that's tax increases at or around the rate of inflation, that vague promise. She wasn't running as a progressive. She ran as a centrist, semi-fiscal conservative in the early part of the campaign and then tried to swing back.
After the provincial
campaign
went bust.
So if she'd come out, if she had from the beginning been a progressive, who Olivia Chow actually is, there's that West Wing scene, the let Bartlett be Bartlett thing. I feel like if they'd let Chow be Chow, she'd probably be in the mayor's seat, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And that's what cost her the campaign, in my
Is
opinion.
Warren Kinsella to blame, or is the provincial
No, we
NDP
can blame
to
him
blame,
for
or who's to
everything.
blame for Olivia's defeat? What do you think, Andrea?
I think it's the voters, frankly. I think that one of the big things that we desperately need to have a conversation about is voting reform, not just at the municipal level, but at all levels of government. We need to talk seriously that our we need rank ballots at the
What happened
municipal
with rank
level.
ballot?
Well, it's because right now it's in the city's court, isn't it?
No, it's provincial.
It's
The provincial-
so the
They've said
provincial
they'll have them in place for the next municipal election. They have the Liberals. Yeah.
So that would have changed the landscape considerably. I mean, I think we need to have this conversation at all levels of government, but that certainly would have changed things dramatically at the city level. So I think that the voters need to get more engaged. We need to talk about this. We need to and over the course of many years, we have created this polarized city. We've created this divisive discussion, and the Fords just they just capitalized on that. They didn't create it; it was already there.
Voter turnout was up, though, right? So at least people did show up.
But imagine if we had a ranked ballot system, what that would
I
have
think
looked
Tory
like.
still would have won, though.
Perhaps, but it would have been more representative.
Ms. Z, what do you think?
I think more people turned up because they were more engaged, and they were more engaged because it was more fun.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And not because they were interested in the minutia of city council and policies and law and bylaws and the like. And I think that what's going to happen now is that they are going to go back to being as bored as they were 5 years ago. And yes, I can't see municipal politics selling newspapers or generating television ratings the way that the Fords did. And I am concerned about that because there will not be the level of scrutiny by the media, and certainly not the level of engagement by the public. And just watch the next municipal election. Whenever it comes, there's going to be a lower voter turnout than there was 2 elections ago.
And why do you think Olivia didn't get across the finish line there?
You know what? I don't know. I really don't get it. I think there was definitely a racist element and a sexist element, and we saw that not just with her, but with several other candidates in the city, other women, whether they were running for, the school positions or city council. And I think that ran right through the election. And I also feel, when we saw that Sun cartoon that mocked her, and I mean, it just made her look like, that constant Mao dressed character in Doonesbury.
Did they ever apologize for that? I know they were asked
I don't
to.
think so.
No, in fact, the cartoonist was laughing about it, and mocking it on Twitter.
There was one of those, I was sorry for people who were offended, but here's what I meant kind of.
Yeah, it was like a sorry, not sorry kind of thing.
Said,
Yeah.
I always draw.
This is how I draw
from the
people.
NDP and Mao
Oh
outfits.
yeah.
that's
I
what
always draw the NDP like this.
Yeah.
Really?
And also, amongst the quote-unquote chattering classes, and I include all 4 of us in there, there was a large anti-Kinsella sentiment, and we saw that constantly on social media. And when there was a rumor running around that he was going to stand for the Liberal nomination in Toronto Danforth, I mean, people went nuts.
Yeah.
Interestingly, because, after all, he's got a column, and after all, he's got a successful blog, and he's still out there as a political force. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Peter Cormo's line about Kinsella, which I always like, was, he's an absolute rat, but we wish he were our rat, which is probably the, political answer to Warren Kinsella.
But he was right? When he made that comment about Smart Track and how it avoided the priority neighborhoods, and yes, he probably shouldn't have used that inflammatory language. He probably shouldn't have called it segregationist. It was actually classist, is what he should have said. But ultimately, he was right. And Antonia is right. There was so much about this campaign from all sides, except for the people of color, that was just so grossly racist and exploiting that racism and exploiting people's fears of the race of different races, and it was horrible to watch.
On the side of the nice Tory, what was interesting about his campaign in part is he was trying to kind of build this. Well, they all were, but he reached out to NDPers to kind of get them on board. He called me before a debate, asked me what the issues were in the neighborhood and things, which was kind of nice of him. And yet, when he did get into office, the so-called progressives on city council got eliminated from any of the choice roles. Is this the wave of the future, do you think, at City Hall, Ashley? Do you think this means it's not going to be... What's happening there?
This is a pet issue of mine. I thought there weren't any parties at City Hall. This is my... Because I find this infuriating. Because during the first, when Chow... And we always... Whenever people talk about Chow losing the campaign, everybody forgets that she was leading in the polls for the first 4 or 5 months of the campaign, and healthily. So obviously there was a point at which people wanted to vote for her. So I've always taken a bit of grain of salt with the race and sex arguments, but we can put that aside for a second, because in those months, if you even tried to say, how can Olivia Chow, a lifelong New Democrat, say she's going to run the city on net zero or close to inflation, tax increases, when she's always been a tax and spend New Democrat, people would come at you on Twitter and be like, she's not a Democrat. There are no political parties at City Hall. Meow, 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 meow. And then those same people, after the election, when Tory didn't put any so-called New Democrats on his thing, we're like, well, there's no New Democrats. It's like, but wait, 6 months ago, you said there were no political parties at City Hall. So I sometimes take a bit of umbrage, like that bugs me, because it's playing two sides of the same coin. Although I do think there were some progressive voices
on his executive.
My city councilor, Mark. Oh my God.
There's moderates. Yeah. There's some moderates.
Pam McConnell. I think she's quite.
She's not on the executive.
Wasn't she his
she's
third deputy mayor?
She's the
figurehead.
Okay,
role.
so I thought she got a vote on the executive with that.
No, okay. and her powers as one of the deputies is she doesn't have any.
Okay, so women, and we've had quite the debate. By the way, if you just tuned in, boy, did you miss a good show. We'll probably repeat it, though, so stay tuned next week. So you're listening to Three Women, your host, Sherry DeNovo, MPP Parkdale High Park. I've got the wonderful Anthony, Mizzy, Zerbasis. I've got Ashley, the wonderful Missy, Csanady, and Andrea Houston, the 3As, the A-team, all speaking about 2014, 2015. We've got just a couple of minutes left. We're going to go one by one. What's going to happen? What's going to be the big news of 2015? And we're going to check up on this, because we'll come back at the end of 2015 and see if we were right. Ashley, what's going to be big news ahead?
We're going to have a lot of court cases to watch. Duffy and Ghomeshi are going to get saturation coverage. That press that was at the Ghomeshi arraignment will continue. We're going to see the oil prices, where they go, is going to dictate a lot of what happens in 2015, and I think it will have a huge effect on the election if they keep going downwards. And obviously, we're going to be in campaign mode from now till October.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be election. I think we're just going to be bombarded with election coverage and how all of those issues factor in and are politicized.
And what do you think is going to happen if we have an election, Miss
Oh,
Andrea?
gosh. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've been going over my head. I think the cynical me thinks that we're going to, unfortunately, and it breaks my heart to say this, I think we're going to be stuck with another Harper government. I think it's going to be a minority, but just that's the way it's going, and I just don't see people turning the ship now. They elect the devil they know. I would love to see it change it up, obviously. I would, I would even be, happy with a liberal minority. Is different.
But. Okay, Antonia.
All of the above, with the exception of the liberal minority. I think, just to expand on the oil prices, I think that it's going to be far-reaching and very frightening. Venezuela is being affected. The Saudis are determined to destroy Iran with these oil prices. It's the geopolitical aspects are enormous, and I see Russia turning into a dictatorship under Putin. I mean, it's already bad, but it's going to get worse. And as for domestically, I'm not sure exactly what the impact on our economy will be, but I don't see it as being positive. And in a way, I see that as a positive because